So, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about modern attacks and enterprise defenses, mostly going to be about initial access techniques and how we can counter them. And as you can see in this picture, it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. So we're also going to be going into that regard a little bit. Oh, wait. Wait. Great. So today our agenda is, first of all, I'm going to give a light introduction, what is initial access and so forth, and then we're going to start looking at threat evolution, meaning from the last 10, 15 years to our current day. Then we're going to do deep dive on techniques of the current day attackers. And lastly, I'm going to talk about defense in depth. A little bit about me, I'm Oğuz Bektaş. I'm a consultant in SP research. I followed these certifications. 2018, I did my Linux certificates, though these days I'm doing mostly work based on Windows, actually. And since 2020, I'm a OSCP, and since this year, actually, I did a certification on red team operations. And my current focus areas are red teaming and network security, malware, analysis and development, so a little bit of both sides and exploits. So let's talk initial access. So what is initial access? That's the first question we're going to be answering. And then we're going to explain why do we care about this in the first place. And then we're going to talk about what we can do. So what is initial access? It's basically the methods and techniques that threat actors, which is a fancy way of saying a hacker or an attacker, that they will use to get into your network. And for example, it could be a vulnerability in a public-facing system, for example, a firewall or a VPN product or some web server that's running in an application or something like that. So basically anything that is accessible from the public internet that belongs to the organization in the end. Another one would be leaked or weak credentials. So imagine your password is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that's your administrator password for RDP. Then obviously someone who scans for the RDP ports in the whole internet will be able to find that combination and get into your server. Insider threats is another one. For instance, employee could try to gain access to something that they don't have access to, or they could try selling their credentials to a group of actors. And actually this happened, I think, not too long ago. It was on the news where a group called Lapsus, if I'm not mistaken, was able to acquire credential material by just purchasing it from the employees who work there. Physical infiltration, so it could be someone who sneaks into your office at night, or it could be somebody who goes into your building and acts like, I don't know, maybe a delivery guy or maybe a repairman or something of that sort. And in order to gain access to your network, maybe they will just try to plug some device in your network ports, or I don't know, maybe try to use a rubber ducky or something of that sort to take over a machine that is unlocked. Supply chain attacks, that's another one which is also gaining a lot of traction. The thing is, it doesn't happen all that often, but when it does, the impact is usually pretty big. Thousands of organizations are affected by that. And it is a real risk. And our focus today mostly is going to be actually on phishing with malware. So that just means someone sends you an email or a message or something, and this is not the typical phishing where you would think, well, where the attacker will want to gain access to your credentials or something like that, or to your accounts, but more that they want to gain access to your machine by making you execute something. And that brings us to the next part, which is why do we care about this? Well, obviously, enterprises are juicy targets for attackers. If they get into, for example, a finance department, then they can cause a lot of damage, they can make a lot of money, and that's why it's attractive for attackers in the end. And the second part is that with attackers getting more creative with their techniques, we also need to be aware of these techniques in order to be able to counter them. And lastly, it's just interesting from a technical standpoint. It's just cool to look at these techniques and see how they evolved over time and to learn about them, basically, for both sides. This question was, what can we do about it? But before I can answer that, we have to look into the historical evolution of everything related to phishing, basically. So this is the next part, which is threat evolution. Now we're going to be answering the last question again. So how did we come to this? So if we look at how the threats evolved, there was a huge shift in the last 10 to 15 years in how attackers changed their methods and how also defenders were able to counter them using various technologies. I think I said this already, but in the end, the cat and mouse games continues with increasing pace. So what was the case in 10 years was that there was not a lot of back and forth between attackers and defenders. Basically, attackers were calling all the shots, but now we're seeing that this is changing over time, that defenders are gaining more control over the game itself. So let's go back in time just a little bit to see how we came to this point. So we're going to take a look at a really basic phishing attack chain. And when I say really basic, I mean really basic. So let's take a look at this guy. This is our attacker. And he's going to be creating malicious payloads by using metasploits. So back in the day, actually, there was a tool. So now it's called MSF Venom, but back in the day, it was called MSF Payloads and MSF Encode. So these were two tools, and then it came together MSF Venom. Basically, our attacker will just generate the payloads by using this pre-made tool. They will have an executable. They will attach this executable, and then they will send it to their target at the company with a pretext such as here, install this latest update for your Adobe Reader or something along these lines. Or maybe even just, here's your invoice, and it's going to be a file like invoice.pdf.exe, and since the last part usually isn't shown in Windows, people still click these. And after this user will click and run this application, then the attacker will receive a reverse shell connection. And this is probably how the attacker is going to react after they receive a shell. So in the end, antivirus joins the game, and things actually start changing a little bit for the attacker side. Now, when we look at the same thing, the attacker will do exactly the same scenario, create their payload, attach to the email, write some semi-convincing email, and send it over. Well, once the user downloads and tries to run the executable, it's probably going to be blocked by the antivirus. So looks like it's problem solved, right? Well, attackers don't usually give up so easily, so they will try to obfuscate their binary. And for example, the only difference in this case would be that the attacker creates their payload, and once it's done, they will try to pack or encrypt the binary, or try to hide the fact that this is a malicious payload in one way or the other. And once that's done, they will attach it and send it just like before. And when the antivirus will scan this binary, it's going to be like, yep, I don't have this in my database, so must be fine. And it's just going to run like normal, and the attacker is going to receive a shell. And this kind of sums up how antivirus works, at least back in the day. And so the good things and bad things for antivirus, basically, that it protects you against common malware, and it adds a basic protection layer to your system. And it is really a basic protection layer. So to elaborate on that, it depends on a signature database. That's why it's only good for protecting against common malware, because if this is not something that is discovered before or known before, then it's not going to be in the database and it's not going to be detected. Another pain point for antivirus for a long time, at least, was that it was static analysis only, which means you just get a binary on your machine and it will scan the binary without ever running it or without ever doing anything. It will just take a look at the contents and it will try to match what it has with on the database. So in the end, it's basically a glorified web. So this was obvious after some time that the antivirus wasn't so good at detecting stuff. So defenders thought, okay, what can we do? Then mail gateway became a thing. What I mean by mail gateway is something that stands between your user and the internet, basically, and it monitors every incoming and outgoing email. And if it detects some sort of suspicious content, it will just block it outright. So when we look at our last scenario, the attacker will create a malicious payload, perform the obfuscation, packet encrypt it, whatever, and then attach the email, attach the binary to the email, and then send it over. And once that's done, the mail gateway will take a look at this email. And if the attacker just puts the executable as a direct attachment to the email, then it's most likely going to be blocked. So this way, looks like problem solved. The user didn't get phished. Everything is fine. But it's not so easy, as the attacker will try to find a way around this. So instead of attaching a file, an attacker can simply upload this binary after, for example, putting it in a zip file to some hosting platform like, I don't know, Google Drive, Dropbox, whatever you can think of, create a download link for that, and then just send a link to the target. And when the mail gateway looks at it, it's just going to see, yeah, this is a Dropbox link, this is probably fine. Then it will go through, and the user will download it, run it, and the attacker will receive a shell just like before. So in the end, mail gateway didn't really solve the problem as we thought it would. However, good things and bad things about mail gateway again is, for example, they can block abuse file formats like executables or, I don't know, suspicious content. And also, obviously, it will help you reduce the amount of spam that you get in your inbox, which is also one of the jobs of the mail gateway, not just blocking malicious payloads or suspicious artifacts, but also just detecting spam in general, because this was a huge problem 10 years ago. It still is, but not as much as before. Bad thing about mail gateway is it's not very good at scanning links. So obviously, when it's an attachment, it's not a huge problem. The mail gateway just has to look at it, look at the content of the file, and match it against the database. And if it's malicious or not, then they can know it. But with links, there are other factors that we have to consider. For example, the attacker could host a link in a way that it's impossible for the email gateway to see the real content of it. So it could, for example, be something that only works with JavaScript. That means the mail gateway would have to use a headless browser to get the JavaScript running and then see the real payload behind it or the real page behind it. Or it could be something that actually just, for example, detects the user agent of the mail gateway and then block it. Or it could be some sort of whitelist that only allows certain browsers to access it. So there are many ways that attackers can get around scanning links in emails that are not very obvious at first glance. Another pain point for mail gateway is that obviously it has some sort of AV software in the background that it's performing the scans with. So this is still based on signatures. And the last point would be that if you block some types of files that might not be so good for your business, for example, if you're blocking PDFs or Office documents, then maybe you're going to have some problems by people who you work with that they want to send you something and it's just getting blocked in your email gateway and you never receive it. So that's another point. And the next thing that they came up with, obviously, was something that the mail gateway couldn't really do, which is application whitelisting. So when we think about application whitelisting, what I mean is you have a list of applications or some sort of rule set that allows an application to run or not. And when we look at this graph, if we see the attacker creates the payload, performs the obfuscation, sends the payload into a cloud platform, creates a link, sends the email, delivers email. But once the user actually tries to run the executable, it will get blocked because it's not in the list. So you can think of it as sort of a bouncer in front of a nightclub, and if you're not on the guest list, then you're not getting in. And this is the pop-up that you will see. So this also solved problems for some time. attackers were getting desperate. They were thinking, okay, what can we really do now? Can't really just send you my binary and let you execute it or something. So they came up with even more stuff to bypass application like this thing. And in this case, we're going to look at Office macros, PowerShell, trusted folders. And this is, now it's starting to get a little bit complicated, but bear with me. Basically, the attacker will only create the malicious payload, upload the payload to somewhere, Google Drive, whatever. And they will also create a Word, Excel, Office document in the end with a macro. And a macro is just a little program that allows Office to do extra stuff. And in this case, this macro is going to be downloading this binary that the attacker already uploaded in order to run it. And what happens is it creates the macro-based document. They will send it as an attachment. It will get delivered. And the user will open this Word document thinking it's some legitimate file. And once they do, there's usually going to be something like, please click enable content to see the rest of the document or to decrypt the document, some sort of trick to make the user enable macros. And once they do enable the macros, then it will call, for example, in this case, PowerShell.exe to download the malicious executable. And then this is the important part for bypassing the application whitelisting, is that it will be placed in a trusted folder. So obviously, when you're just sending the binary directly, it's not so easy to tell the user, yeah, please place this in, I don't know, Windows System 32 or something like that. But when we have already code execution, then it's possible to just place the binary in a trusted folder and then run it from there. So when you run the binary from this directory, which is just an example and normally is writable by any user in the system, which means it's going to be usually no problem to drop the binary there and just run it. And in this case, the attacker will obviously receive a shell connection again. And I think this sums up so application whitelisting and good things, bad things. Well, it will stop your users from running unknown executables. If you're downloading some random stuff from the internet, you're not going to be able to run it unless your system admin will allow you to run it. And it can stop malware in its tracks, as we saw before. When we were sending the binary directly, there was no way to get it running. Many things is obviously the trusted locations, which is still a weak point of application whitelisting. So everything under Windows System 32 is, I think, by default a trusted location. And another thing is that Microsoft signed binaries are also still allowed, which is why we were able to, for example, run PowerShell in the first place. So some of you might think, okay, you send a macro document, but my mail gateway will block this. You're not going to be able to deliver this macro-based malicious documents to my users. Well, the attacker can do multiple things. If any of you has any idea, please raise your hand. Nobody? Okay, well, first thing is you can just send a link. You don't have to attach this. So the mail gateway will just look at it and be like, okay, this is a link. And if it's configured properly, then nobody's going to see that it's a macro-enabled document. And there's another technique, which is not so well known, which is called remote template injection. And this is basically a way to tell Word to fetch the remote Word template, which will be then loaded from a remote location from the internet. And this template will contain a macro. But that means that the document that we're sending to the user doesn't really contain a macro when you look inside. So your mail gateway is still probably going to allow this to pass, even if you say, I don't want macro-enabled documents to get to my users. And one exploit recently, I think last year, that this was a relevant topic one was the Polino exploit, which was a Microsoft Office exploit, which used exactly this method by using remote template injection and protocol vulnerability. they were able to create Word documents which immediately caused code execution to happen without actually enabling any macro or anything of that sort. So just because that you block macros doesn't really mean that it's safe. Now we're going to talk about behavioral detection. And in this case, the chain until now is the same. The only difference is once we drop our malicious binary in this trusted location and we try to run it, it might get blocked by behavior detection, for example, because it does something that it's that Windows Defender or whichever antivirus solution finds suspicious, like being dropped by winword.exe and then PowerShell and then trying to open a connection to an unknown domain name, something of that sort. Or that it writes a persistence mechanism like a registry key, and this can be suspicious. Or it might be also not necessarily that, so in this case, it looks like as if the attacker didn't receive a shell, but it could also be that you do receive a shell, but something you do afterwards will cause a behavior detection to trigger, and then you will lose your shell. Again, problem solved. This was really good for the time being. When it came out, it was a huge thing. But the cat and mouse game never stops, so they found another way to get around this, which is PowerShell in-memory execution in this case. And this actually is a little simpler method than trying to upload, download binaries and dropping them in various locations and then trying to run them. Instead, the attacker will create a Metasploit or Empire payload. If you don't know what is Empire, it was basically a SQL framework that back in its heyday with PowerShell being super popular was also the go-to choice for most attackers since it was able to bypass detections at that time. So the attacker will create a payload, embed this into a macro, and once that's done, they can just send it normally to their target. And once the target opens and enables macro, this time, instead of dropping any payloads to disk, it will actually run the payload in memory in PowerShell.exe, which means PowerShell is a trusted binary. There's nothing sketchy going on, at least from the point of view at that time. And therefore, the attacker will receive a connection again. And this time it gets really hard because there is no binary to detect. There is no download happening or anything of that sort. So this was actually really tricky. And this was, I mean, this chain was pretty much the way to go for phishing for the longest time until something else came along, which we'll talk about later. But to sum it up, basically, and as I said, for example, writing a run key in the registry or something like that might be a suspicious action. So this was an advantage for behavioral detection when you look at legacy antivirus implementations. And now there's a huge difference that the biggest pain point was that it was static analysis only and nothing else. So it's not signature based, obviously. And finally, it's a runtime component for antivirus. So yay. However, it's still biased towards trusted binaries, like we saw in PowerShell case. And it still depends partially on signatures. So that means, for example, you might get detected if you do something in a really certain way. But if you slightly twist that, then you can still get around it. For example, instead of writing a run key, maybe you can create a startup file or something like that. And then came in AMSI, which stands for Anti-Malware Scanning Interface. And this was basically a way to stop the problem, which was PowerShell back then. And in this case, same chain. The only difference is that once we try to run our malicious payload in PowerShell.exe, it's going to be blocked by AMSI. And the reason for that is AMSI was basically, so if I just skip here, Well, AMSI was basically an interface that you can implement in your antivirus engine. So Microsoft had its own AMSI engine, and different antivirus vendors also implemented their own solutions. But in the end, it was all the same. And the main point was here that when you generate some default payload from Metasploit or something, it's still going to be detected, even though you're not dropping any binary or anything like that, because the content of the PowerShell commands are being scanned by themselves by AMSI. So in this case, the attackers will adapt by coming up with an AMSI bypass, and basically the previous chain that I just showed you can be used if you obfuscate your tools enough. What I mean by that is you can just try to replace null dead strings with benign strings. Basically, if you're trying to run, I don't know, invoke Kerberos, you can say invoke posts, and it will just go through just fine. And by doing this iteratively, you can completely get rid of all the signatures in your scripts, and then you're still able to use these tools just like before. Another option was various methods of patching PowerShell memory in order to disable AMSI or cripple it in one way or the other, just to make sure that the commands that you run after the bypass aren't going to be detected. And you can also look at this to get a picture of how it was. Basically, just scanning really superficially. And the problem was the same as antivirus. Though the good thing was that it covers a lot of stuff. It covers .NET, it covers Visual Basic, it covers JScript, it covers PowerShell, and it makes it really hard to use public tools. So for the average run-of-the-mill attacker, it actually does cause a big problem, because you can't just pull scripts off of GitHub and run them just without getting detected whatsoever. And this caused a big impact, obviously, on script-based tradecraft, which was for, let's say, 5 years really common, that all the offensive tools were being written in PowerShell and .NET, and still is to this day, but nowadays it's harder to use them in real engagements. The third thing is, again, the same as antivirus, really. It's not a runtime component. It will scan the command that you're running at runtime, but it won't actually try to, I don't know, emulate the result of this command or something in order to find out what's happening. It is basically just string matching in the end. So it can be bypassed with some simple tricks like I described before. But still better than nothing, right? So now we can look at more recent developments now that we gave a good historical context. So AI and machine learning became super important. What do I mean by that? It basically depends on adoption of EDR. And EDR is the next gen antivirus, as you might call it. And the way that this works is that when you enroll your computer in your EDR solution, for example, Microsoft Defender, endpoints, and I don't know, CrowdStrike and things like that, they will collect all kinds of telemetry from your machine, meaning every process that's spawned, every thread that's created for these processes, everything that you open or close, or based on different actions, it will be sent to the cloud. And then it's going to be analyzed by some machine learning algorithm in order to determine the baseline. And once that's done, they can say, okay, this action that this user just did is out of their baseline, so it's suspicious. Or maybe it could be just, okay, this action matches some signature that we already have, and therefore it's suspicious. And that's why also sharing indicators of compromise and tactics, techniques, and procedures has become even more important than before. And we'll get into that just in a second. So before that, we have to talk about another thing, which is the Office macro extinction event, which happened really recently. And basically what happened was, if you're not familiar with Markov the web, this is if I have to explain it shortly, it's basically whenever you download a file from the internet with your browser, on Windows at least, this file will have an attribute, and it will say, yeah, this file was downloaded from the internet, specifically from this website, for example. And then when you do have that attribute on your file, it's easy to tell if this file was, where did it originate from. And what Microsoft did was to kill off this phishing frenzy with Office macros for the last 10 years. They decided, okay, when you receive a document from a remote source, which is not trusted, it's going to be marked with mark of the web. And if it is mark of the web, then you cannot run macros anymore, even if you want to. And that's why threat actors started experimenting with different file formats to fill the void, basically, that was created by this macro extension event, let's say. However, Office macros can still be used. They're not completely over. You can still use it if you're phishing internally. So if an attacker gets a mailbox account in your organization, then they could still send a phishing email from this account. And when you try to open the email and download it, then it's actually not going to be untrusted zone. In this point, it's going to be a trusted zone because it comes from within your organization. So there is still some hope for Office macros, but they are pretty much dead for external phishing purposes. And now we can actually do a little bit of a deep dive as to what comes afterwards that attackers are doing. So with advanced malware protections, attackers obviously had to come up with new techniques, and they were pretty creative, to be honest. For example, PDFs came back. I don't know if you remember PDFs being used for phishing, but now this is a thing again. And what is the case, for example, if you look at this, this is a really common lure that you can see where you have updates to Adobe Acrobat, and if you click downloads, then you're going to receive an update, right? And this is actually just the image in front of the PDF, and behind the image is a clickable link, and once you click on it, it will redirect you to the malicious payload. Other in the wild examples that I could find from Malware Bazaar and some other sources, if you take a look, you will notice that a lot of these are actually really similar in terms of what they try to accomplish. So they're just trying to make you click inside the PDF in order to download some other file, or to make you think that, I don't know, that you're requesting access or something of that sort, basically. And yeah, this is pretty common these days, because since macros are dead, they have to come up with some other mechanism for delivering second stage payloads. Another short one was OneNote. So after the extinction event, OneNote became super popular for attackers because of the fact that mark of the web was not being applied properly for attachments that were inside notebooks. Though this is already patched and there are detections existing, so nowadays if you try to send a phishing email with OneNote, then it will still be detected or blocked. But it looks pretty much just like the PDFs, basically. The only difference is instead of downloading a secondary payload, the payload is already embedded inside the file, and this is actually hidden behind this button visually, so that when you click the open button, it will try to run this embedded file. Is the screen getting darker, or
it's sunset? This is why I think. This is, I think, Windows feature.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So, what else did attackers do? Can everyone see this, or on the back? Okay. So they just try to revive old file formats as much as possible. Visual Basic, that's the same language that you use in macros, but it can be a standalone script. And JavaScript, which is not your typical JavaScript. This is actually ran by Windows scripting host, and it's a derivative of ECMAScript, if I'm not mistaken, but basically this is a client-side programming language for Windows, which means you can still get code execution with it. And that looks like this. Also, double extensions are really common. I now realize that I forgot to mention that. So it could be just like document.pdf.js, and usually the last bit is cut out because of default settings in Explorer. HTA, as you might have seen in the previous example with OneNote, there was an embedded HTA file. This is also the case, and it can run JS or VBS inside the HTML. And another one is compiled help file, which looks like this. This is the help pages that you used to get with programs back in the day. And it can also run Visual Basic, it can run JavaScript and some other stuff. Another important one is Windows shortcuts. So LNK is the file extension. And the most important one about this file format is that you can disguise it as different file formats. So it can look like a folder, it can look like a video, it can look like a cute dog picture, something like that. And actually, when you look at it, so it can also be a PDF, obviously, and when you look at it, the only visual difference between these two is this little arrow that is on the left corner. And when you do try to open it, if it's Markov to left, then you get a warning such as this. If it's not Markov to left, then you don't get any warning, and it just immediately executes. And you can see in this warning that it's a shortcut and that it has the LNK extension at the end, even though Explorer won't show it. And this is actually a different case for LNK files. You have to activate an extra setting inside your registry, if I'm not mistaken, to be able to see the extension in the first place. Even if you made Explorer show file extensions, LNK file extension is not shown by default. And when you right click and go to properties in one of these, then you can see, for instance, there is a target and there is a way to run it, and there is convenient change icon button, which you can use to make it look like whatever you want. And the target is actually probably the most important bit. In this case, we can see, I don't know if you can read this, but it basically says Windows system32 cmd.exe/c to run a command, and then there's a path for SMB server on evil.com, evil.exe. So it will run this remote binary, and yeah. You can also see that it can be run as minimized. So when you do click on it, you don't really see anything unless that's what the attacker wants you to see. So what you could do is you create a LNK file, you rig it to run your malicious payload in one way or the other, and then pop up some actual decoy PDF that the user sees at the end. Another thing is container files. And main advantages is that you can pack multiple payloads into the same file. So if you just want to be sure, then you can put all these JS, HTA, etc. into a single zip and send it in. I don't know, maybe they click one or the other, you know. And you can have built-in encryption for zip files or 7 zip files also, which means when you send it over, the mail gateway or the antivirus isn't able to immediately detect what is inside it and if it's malicious or not. And also, it can help you bypass mail gateway rules. For example, you can't send an exit directly, but maybe if it's inside the zip, then it's fine. And also, there are some historical Markov to web bypasses, specifically with ISO file format, that allowed putting still macro-based office documents inside. And since it's inside the ISO and the user opens it, it wouldn't have the Markov to web, but the macro would still execute. Nowadays, this is fixed already. And the disadvantage is that it might be more suspicious if you're sending a single file, then obviously it's a little sketchy that it's in a zip file or something like that. Next up is HTML smuggling. This is basically, you can see this little piece of JavaScript here is that it will try to download a file without user interaction. So as soon as the user visits your page, it will automatically just download a file. And the way this works is you create, so you have the contents of your malicious file encoded in one way or the other, and then it's going to decode it, and then you're going to create an anchor element on the page, set a download attribute for it, and then you create a blob object in JavaScript from the decoded file contents. And then you can create a download URL from this blob object and then just automatically click on it, basically without the user having to do anything besides visiting the page. And the cool thing with this is that there is no actual HTTP request for the download itself. So that means you're also bypassing web proxies, which might block, for example, executable from being downloaded or something of that sort, or that it just scans the file being downloaded and decides if it's malicious or not. Another thing is that you can just also have it as an attachment. You can have it as an HTML file that you attach to your email, and this will work just as fine as if you would send this as a link to a web page that you host. And actually, the only disadvantage is that mark of the web is still being applied since it's still happening from your browser. Living off the land, some of you might have heard about this, but basically you can use, for example, PowerShell is a good example, I guess. You can use native binaries on the machine that are already existing in Windows to perform malicious actions, such as, I don't know, downloading further payloads, executing something else, things like that. And the main advantage, obviously, that you can bypass application whitelist, just like with PowerShell case. But there isn't only PowerShell. There are many, many other files and executables and scripts that are all over Windows, and you can see a good overview in this website. And yeah, exactly. You have less scrutiny by anti-malware, and obviously it's not a huge deal when, I don't know, you're not running some malicious binary, you're just using a system utility that already exists. So this makes it also reliable across most Windows versions, at least from, I don't know, Windows 7 onwards. Some of these still work in Windows XP, but there are some key differences actually. And the disadvantage is that since these are public, detections exist, and it can be actually pretty bad for you if that's the way that you get detected, because there's not much you can do about it unless you find a way to do it in a completely different way, let's say. What else? We got HTTPS and DNS. So when you look at it here, back in the day, you could just send your Metasploit payloads and have it connect back to you over port 4444 on a row of TCP sockets, and it would just work. But nowadays, it doesn't, because there are web gateways and firewalls in place, which will, for instance, you can configure your firewall and web gateway to say, right, nobody gets out of this network unless they're using HTTPS or DNS, which makes it actually almost needed for an attacker to use these in order to get a C2 connection in the first place, because otherwise you're just not coming outside of the network. And another advantage is that it allows you to blend in with network traffic just a little better. And the further point for that is actually living off trusted sites. So in the previous one, we have an attacker web server, but in this case, the attacker doesn't really have any web server. They're just using some public infrastructure, one of these or another one, in order to communicate back and forth with their infected machines. So that means they're hiding behind legitimate traffic. It's really hard to detect this in most organizations. And actually, the only disadvantage for an attacker is that if they do get caught, then the cloud platform can just disable their account, and then they lose all their access basically, unless there's some fallback going on. Another cool one is DLL sideloading and proxying. So this is basically another way to bypass application worklists. In the end, whenever you run a binary in Windows and it tries to load some DLL, which is a library file, then it will go through this order of search to find this DLL. So when we take a look at this real life scenario, this was a vulnerability, or is a vulnerability in OneDrive. So OneDrive will try to load secure32.dll, which normally resides in Windows System 32. In this case, it's system directory. However, the application directory comes first, And the application directory of OneDrive happens to be in local app data, Microsoft OneDrive, which is writable by the current user. So that means an attacker can simply plant their malicious DLL into this folder and call it secure32 DLL. And when OneDrive runs, for example, at startup, and searches for the secure32.dll, it will first look at the application folder and then find it. And actually, this happens to be the malicious payload that's planted by the attacker. And DLL proxying is actually the same thing, with the key difference being instead of just dropping your malicious payload, you also make it so that the real functions inside that were exported by secure32 DLL are also proxied to the real one in Windows 32, so the program actually stays functional and nobody notices anything. Maybe one of the coolest ones is fish to persist, because nowadays, when you think about it, with EDR and event correlation, all kinds of telemetry being collected and analyzed and stuff like this, it's really hard to get a shell back. And the main reason for that is EDR will correlate the events that are happening through your computer, on your computer, and then it will decide if the combination or the sequence of these events are suspicious. But when you add a big time delay between the time when you actually fish the target and when you actually receive the shell, then this correlation is much harder to make. Basically, instead of just immediately receiving a shell, you just want to set up some sort of persistence mechanism, which will trigger later. It can be a scheduled task, it can be a registry key, it can be a auto start, it can be a DLL hijacking. So in theory, you could combine this and this in order to create a very stealthy attack, where all that happens when the user clicks your malicious payload is that it will drop a DLL on disk, and no malicious action will actually take place until later when OneDrive will run on its own, or when the user clicks it, or when it just starts on boot, that you will receive a shell. And this way, it's really hard for the EDR to say, okay, this happened because of that, because there is like a huge time delay. And I think this is the last one, process injection. So this is not necessarily an initial access technique, but it's still important to know that in order to run our payloads, most of the time these days, this is the best approach. You just want to avoid dropping anything to disk as much as you can, and run everything in memory, basically. And this means that you have some trusted process on the machine, say explorer.exe, and you have your malicious codes that you want to run. You could inject your malicious code into this trusted process and kick off a new thread and just let it execute your code in the end. The problem is that it can also be a detection opportunity for the blue team if you didn't implement it correctly, or if you didn't implement it correctly according to that EDR. And how it looks in really abstract terms is you have your own process and you have your target process. And basically you open a handle, you create a new section in that target process, you write your code, and then you set a thread to the start point, the entry point of this code block. And it will basically just start a new thread and explorer.exe, for instance, and your code will run from there. Okay.
I will just switch on the light. It doesn't take it really very sharp. Okay. It's okay with you. Sure.
Now I think the screen is really good to see.
I think very fast.
Wrong.
Yeah, looks good. So it's good. It's fine. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Spotlight.
So this brings us to defense in depth, which is basically now we're going to answer the last question, is what we can do about all of this. So in order to protect ourselves, we have to think about first what is defense in depth. It's basically a comprehensive approach in order to, it's a layered approach basically to create as many roadblocks for an attacker as possible, which causes more chances for detection and for prevention. What do I mean by that? So if you increase the time and effort which is necessary for an attacker to successfully compromise your machine or your whole network, then it's actually going to be a deterrent for the attacker. It's going to be a huge pain to just get anything running because everything is being blocked, nothing works, and at some points they're just going to move on to something else. They don't always have the attention span or the patience to actually go through with all of this. So they might just look on, okay, I can't fish this guy, I'm just gonna go look for some RDP with a weak password or something. And this is a non-exhaustive list of all the security controls that I could think of, basically. And you can think of it as an onion with layers that makes the attackers cry. And as much as you can stop them or make it harder for them in the way, it will just make it more painful for them, and they will just give up at some point. And if I have to highlight the most important ones, I would say user awareness is pretty important, because even with all of these detections and prevention mechanisms, etc., there are still attackers that will be able to bypass all of these, basically. And from then on, it pretty much comes down to how you react to this and how your users are trained. If they are trained well, then they will know when it's something like suspicious or looks like phishing, and then they won't click it, and then you don't have to worry about it, basically. But if they do get phished, which can happen to anyone actually, then most important actually, which is not here, unfortunately, is incident response. That is a very important point, since incidents will happen no matter what you try, and there's always going to be blind spots. But by reducing this to a minimum, we can make it possible that we have a good night's sleep without having to think about which attacker is in my network or something. And another important point for that is the pyramid of pain. Maybe you've heard about this. It's basically, if you look at these pieces of information, so a hash value is, for instance, if you have a malicious binary and you get a hash, is trivial for an attacker to change. They can, in the end, just change a single byte inside the binary, and it will have a completely different hash since it's based on content, right? And if you block, for example, their IP addresses, they can just find a new IP address. It's not really that hard. They can use proxies. They can compromise other machines to use as proxies, etc. Then you could try blocking domain names. It could be that you see their domain name that was in a phishing email, or it could be that you see some weird communication going on from one of your endpoints to a domain name, and then you realize, okay, this is their command and control infrastructure. You just block it. It's not the end of the world for the attacker. Again, they can just get a new domain name. They can compromise another website to use as a domain name. But when you go higher up the pyramid, it starts getting pretty bad for the attacker's perspective, at least. When you say, okay, I don't know which domain you're connecting to, but I know exactly how your network traffic looks like, then you can block that based on some specific attribute of that traffic. Then it's going to be pretty annoying for the attacker, because they have to actually change their tool, change their network traffic fingerprints, and this adds a whole new level that is extra effort, basically. Host artifacts in this case mean where they drop their persistence, for example, what is the file name called, or what sort of mechanisms or artifacts that are left on your host, not by hash, but just in an abstract manner. If you can block their tools, that's even better, Because imagine you get into a network, but you can't run your tools. So this actually causes a big problem for most attackers, because then they have to probably change their whole tool set. They have to obfuscate a bunch of stuff. It's going to take a long time. And the worst one for the attackers is the TTPs, the tactics and techniques and procedures. So this is basically a specific technique. If you can block it away completely, then this causes a big problem in most attackers' attack chain. What do I mean? For example, I don't know, if you can completely block off past the hash attacks in your network, then you're severely limiting their ability to perform lateral movements. Or if you can, I don't know, again, completely block, say, connecting to a TCP row socket from your network, then they're not going to be able to reverse shell. They have to use HTTPS or DNS or something that goes through. And that's why it's the worst one for attackers, because if you can completely get rid of methods that they use, for example, I don't know, phishing with a certain type of payload or something like that, then it's really hard to recover from that. And the attacker's nightmare, if everything that I just talked about is implemented properly, then this is what they should see when they close their eyes to go to sleep at night. And yeah, I hope it was helpful and enjoyable. And if you have any questions, then please go ahead.